In 2000, in the Lombardy town of Abbiategrasso, a massive factory opened its doors. It was a cathedral of industrial ambition, sprawling across 50,000 square meters, equipped with cutting-edge assembly lines, climate control, and enough capacity to supply a nation. Yet the machines never hummed. The production shifts never arrived. Not a single television ever rolled off these automated lines. This was the vision of Carlo Vici, the owner of Mivar, who had spent decades building the most trusted television in Italy. By the time the factory was ready, the world had shifted. The cathode ray tube, which Vici had perfected, was being abandoned for flat panels. The heavy glass screens that once defined the Italian living room were suddenly obsolete. Millions of euros in investment sat under the silent lights of a ghost factory, while competitors from Asia flooded the market with screens that were thinner, lighter, and faster to produce. It was a monument to total industrial independence in an era of global supply chains. But the real story of Mivar is not the story of a shuttered plant. It is the story of how an entire industrial ecosystem, from the factory floor to the repair bench, collapsed when the physical reality of the television changed forever. At European Television Brand Memories, we investigate the industrial systems and domestic rituals that once shaped our living rooms. We trace the rise and fall of the brands that define generations, moving beyond the logo to uncover the factories, repair benches, and engineering choices that truly mattered. Subscribe to join us as we reconstruct the history of the objects that brought the world into our homes. In 1945, Italy was a country in ruins. The industrial heartland of Milan was struggling to rebuild, and television was little more than a concept discussed in engineering circles. This was the environment into which Carlo Vici stepped. Vici was not a polished corporate executive. He was a self-taught technician with an obsession for radio components. He founded Mivar, Milano Vici Apparecchi Radio, in a small workshop, initially focusing on the basics. The vacuum tubes and electrical components needed to keep a fractured nation connected. Vici's genius was not in high-level marketing, but in radical self-sufficiency. As Italy moved into the 1950s and the first public broadcasts of RAI began to reach living rooms, the television set transformed from a luxury item into a social necessity. While other companies relied on imported parts or complex, fragile designs that required expensive, specialized labor to fix, Vici moved in the opposite direction. He simplified. By the 1960s, the Mivar television became a fixture in the homes of the Italian working class. These were not the most stylish sets on the market, nor were they the most expensive, but they were designed with a clear, almost militant philosophy. The chassis was standardized, the components were accessible, and the schematics were printed so clearly that a local repairman in a small village could troubleshoot a fault with a basic soldering iron. This was the Italian miracle viewed from the inside of a living room. A family would spend weeks, sometimes months, saving for a Mivar. When it arrived, it wasn't just a screen. It was a long-term investment. The wood-grain cabinet matched the sideboard, and the television sat on a dedicated table, positioned to be the focal point of the evening. Vici understood his customer base better than his competitors did. He knew that in the rural South or the industrial suburbs of the North, the biggest fear wasn't a lack of features. It was the fear of the television breaking down and becoming a worthless box of glass and wire. Mivar solved this by becoming the unbreakable choice. The company grew organically, fueled by this domestic trust. Vici didn't play the stock market. He reinvested profits into the factory floor. Every lira earned was used to bring another production process in-house, from the plastic molding to the final assembly. By the 1970s, Mivar had effectively integrated its entire supply chain. They weren't just assembling televisions. They were creating a closed-loop system where they controlled the cost, the quality, and the repairability of every unit. But as the company scaled, the very independence that had built the brand began to create a dangerous rigidity. Vici had built a system designed to endure, but he had built it in a world that was about to accelerate in ways he refused to acknowledge. The company had mastered the art of the CRT, yet they were becoming increasingly isolated from the rapid, globalized technological shifts that were beginning to move toward the horizon. By the early 1970s, Carlo Vici had cracked the code of the Italian market. While the global industry was obsessed with pushing the boundaries of electronics complexity, Mivar went the other way. The breakthrough was not a flashy innovation that added cost. It was a ruthless commitment to accessibility. The Mivar breakthrough was defined by a specific philosophy, the serviceable architecture. Vichy realized that the true cost of a television wasn't just the purchase price, it was the cost of failure. In Italy, the television was the center of the home, and when it went dark, the silence was deafening. To solve this, Mivar televisions were built with an ingenious, modular layout. When a technician opened the back cover of a 1970s Mivar, they weren't met with a tangled proprietary mess. They saw a clean, logical grid. The power supply, the tuner, and the deflection circuits were laid out in a way that prioritized the soldering iron. Vichy had essentially designed a television that could be repaired at the kitchen table of a rural farmhouse. This accessibility created a powerful feedback loop. Retailers pushed the brand because they knew that when a Mivar broke, and all electronics eventually do, they wouldn't be bombarded with angry customers waiting weeks for imported parts. They could fix it, and the customer would stay loyal. But there was a second, equally critical part of the breakthrough: the remote control. Today, a remote is a minor accessory. In the late 70s and 80s, it was a high-tech status symbol. Vichy introduced a remote design that was as legendary as the television itself: a small, sturdy, plastic unit with oversized tactile buttons that felt like they were engineered to last forever. It didn't have complex menus or hidden layers. It had a dial for volume, a dial for channels, and an on-off switch. That was it. It was a physical manifestation of Vichy's belief that technology should serve the user, not confuse them. This wasn't just about utility, it was about pride. A Mivar set in the corner of a living room in Naples or Milan signaled that the family was modern, connected, and smart enough to invest in something that didn't require a master's degree to operate. The cabinets were often finished in wood-grain veneers, allowing the television to sit comfortably next to an antique credenza or a modern sideboard. However, this very success planted the seeds of a dangerous technological plateau. Because Mivar had optimized the CRT television to such a high degree of cost efficiency and reliability, the company became locked into that specific architecture. They weren't just building TVs, they were defending a fortress built of glass tubes and vacuum technology. By the time the world began to talk about the transition to flat panel displays, Mivar had spent years perfecting a product that was already beginning its slow march toward historical obsolescence. The system was so optimized for the CRT that any deviation from that path felt like a betrayal of the brand's core promise. The very thing that made Mivar the trusted family member of the Italian home would soon become the anchor that kept the company from evolving when the digital tide finally came in. By the 1980s, Mivar had achieved something that few companies in Europe ever managed. It had become a national institution that felt like a local neighbor. If you walked into an appliance store in a provincial town like Abbiategrasso or a bustling street in Milan, you didn't see Mivar fighting for shelf space against the high-end, sleek advertisements of Sony or Philips. You saw Mivar sitting in the middle of the room, positioned as the logical, responsible choice. At its peak, Mivar's scale was immense, yet it was an internal, self-contained scale. The factory in Milan wasn't just a place where parts were bolted together. It was an industrial ecosystem. Vichy's obsession with control meant that Mivar manufactured its own plastic housings, its own transformers, and its own circuit boards. This was the era of the Mivar system. Because they weren't relying on complex global supply chains, they could keep prices lower than anyone else. They were protected from the fluctuations of the dollar or the yen because they were operating on a localized internal economy. This period defined the Mivar memory anchor for millions of Italians. It was the sound of the Sunday afternoon football match on a Rai, broadcast in vivid color on a Mivar tube that seemed to glow warmer than the competition. It was the sight of a family huddled around a Mivar console during the Christmas holidays. The remote control, that chunky piece of engineering, was often the only piece of tech in the house that worked perfectly every single time. It became a tactile extension of the evening ritual. But the real glory of Mivar wasn't found in the sales office. It was found in the repair shop. Vichy had built a network of independent technicians who were the company's greatest ambassadors. Because Mivar provided comprehensive documentation and accessible, standardized components. A Mivar TV was a dream for any repairman. They knew that if a set came in with a faulty capacitor or a blown diode, they could fix it in 30 minutes. They didn't have to wait for proprietary microchips from halfway across the world. They felt a sense of pride in their work because they were keeping a national product alive. This created a unique social contract. The customer didn't just buy a television. They bought a relationship with their local technician in the factory in Milan. It was a closed loop of trust that felt impervious to the globalized world outside. Mivar wasn't just selling screens. They were selling the promise that, no matter what, the broadcast would continue. Yet this was the moment of maximum vulnerability. In the high-ceilinged offices of the Milan factory, Vichy and his management team were looking at balance sheets that showed record growth, reinforced by the rock-solid loyalty of the Italian middle class. They were, by all traditional metrics, the masters of their domain. But they were looking at the world through the lens of a successful CRT business, completely shielded from the tremors happening in the boardrooms of Asia. They were so focused on the efficiency of their internal supply chain that they didn't see the shift in consumer ambition. The Italian consumer was starting to want more than just reliable. They wanted thin. They wanted flat. They wanted the status symbol of a new era. The Mivar system was a fortress, but the fortress was built for a siege that was already ending. The very scale that made them powerful, the reliance on the CRT, the internal manufacture of glass and circuits, was about to become a weight they could no longer carry. The glory of Mivar was, in hindsight, the perfection of a disappearing world. They had optimized the CRT to its ultimate limit, but they had optimized it for a future that was being rewritten in real time by companies that were not interested in building a TV to last 20 years. They were building them to last 5, and then they were building them to be replaced. The first crack in the Mivar fortress didn't come from a dramatic bankruptcy filing or a sudden factory fire. It appeared in the quiet, dusty corners of the electronics retail stores that Carlo Vicci had relied on for decades. By the late 1990s, the visual landscape of the Italian living room was shifting. Consumers were no longer just looking for a reliable box. They were looking for the thin, flat-panel displays they saw in glossy magazines and high-end showrooms. The problem for Mivar was structural. They had built their entire existence around the CRT, the heavy, deep, vacuum-sealed glass tube. Vicci had perfected this technology to a point where Mivar could produce a tube and a chassis for a fraction of the cost of any international competitor. But the move to flat-panel technology, specifically LCDs, was a technological leap that Mivar's closed-loop system simply couldn't accommodate. To build a modern, high-quality LCD TV, a company needed access to panel manufacturing, a multi-billion-dollar investment that Mivar had not made, and which Vicci, with his conservative management style, was unwilling to fund. The first small crack became a chasm when retailers started reallocating floor space. The independent shop owner who once championed Mivar because it was easy to repair and kept customers happy, suddenly found that customers were walking past the Mivar displays to look at the sleek, wall-mountable sets from Sony, Samsung, and LG. When the retailer couldn't move the Mivar inventory, they stopped stocking the brand. This weakened the service network because fewer Mivar sets in the wild meant fewer customers visiting the local technician, which in turn eroded the repair base that had once been the brand's greatest asset. Market forces were compounding this pressure. Price compression was absolute. As Asian manufacturers optimized their global logistics, the cost of a flat screen plummeted. Mivar found itself caught in a pincer move. They were too small to compete with the sheer volume of global giants, yet they were too integrated in their make-everything-in-house philosophy to pivot to outsourcing. Vicci had successfully defended his independent fortress for half a century, but the market was no longer interested in buying from a fortress. It was buying from global networks. The new factory in Abbiategrasso, which was supposed to be the jewel in the crown, became a symbol of this disconnect. Completed around the year 2000, it was a massive, climate-controlled, state-of-the-art facility designed to manufacture the next generation of CRT televisions. But by the time it was ready, the world had essentially moved on. It was like building the world's most efficient steam engine factory on the day the internal combustion engine was invented. The machine sat in pristine condition, the lights flickered in empty aisles, and the thousands of potential jobs that were promised never materialized. By the mid-2000s, Mivar began to assemble sets using imported components, a desperate departure from the 100% Italian promise that had built the brand. It was a clear sign of manufacturing retreat. The badge on the front still said Mivar, but the soul of the product, the internal control, the bespoke circuit design, the localized ecosystem, was fracturing. In 2013, the inevitable happened. Production of all television sets ceased. The closure wasn't just the end of a company, it was the dissolution of a domestic industrial memory. The skilled workers who knew how to calibrate a Mivar tube, the independent repairmen who kept the brand in homes for decades, the shopkeepers who stood by Vichy's side, they were all left in the wake of a digital revolution. The television, once an immovable piece of family furniture that lasted for 15 years, was now a disposable commodity that lasted for 5. The factory in Abbiategrasso stood silent, a physical monument to a vision that refused to bend. The silence inside those halls was the sound of an era ending. The television was no longer a shared family experience produced by local hands. It was a globalized, replaceable screen, and the Mivar name, once the most trusted brand in the Italian home, was left behind in the ruins of the cathode ray tube. Following the cessation of television manufacturing in 2013, the corporate structure of Mivar retreated into the background. Carlo Vichy, the indomitable patriarch who had steered the company for nearly 70 years, passed away in 2021 at the age of 100, closing the final chapter on independent Italian electronics. The legal entity of Mivar did not completely dissolve, but its relationship to the consumer changed fundamentally. The historic manufacturing plant in Milan closed forever, while the unutilized Cathedral of Industry in Abbiategrasso remained an empty monument. In his final years, Vichy famously offered the multi-million euro facility entirely for free to any entrepreneur, even publicly appealing to international tech figures like Elon Musk, on one absolute condition: they had to use the space to employ Italian workers. The offer went completely unaccepted. Today, the Mivar trademark is held by Vichy's heirs, surviving not as a vertical manufacturer, but as a brand name leased through licensing agreements for small domestic appliances and modern electronic furniture, completely decoupled from its historic industrial roots. While the commercial infrastructure has dissolved, the physical objects themselves have found a vibrant afterlife. In the contemporary secondary market, Mivar cathode ray tube televisions are no longer viewed as obsolete junk. They have become highly prized artifacts within the European retro gaming and vintage computing communities. Enthusiasts actively seek out late-model Mivar sets due to their robust internal engineering, pristine RGB SCART video inputs, and remarkably low input latency. Unlike modern flat panels, the Mivar screen displays vintage graphics exactly as their original designers intended. The simplicity Vichy insisted upon means these sets remain highly fixable, with community forums preserving the service manuals the factory once printed freely. This is not empty nostalgia. It is a recognition of structural durability, material quality, and an engineering philosophy that prioritize the lifespan of an appliance over planned obsolescence. Today, the Abbiategrasso site remains a stark, pristine monument of glass and concrete against the Lombardy skyline, an asset optimized for a future that arrived without it. There remains a strange, verified footnote to this industrial story. In 2014, refusing to let his assembly spaces sit dormant, a 94-year-old Vichy briefly redirected his remaining factory hands to manufacture a line of minimalist, geometric furniture under the Mivar name, proving his obsession with physical production could never be entirely silenced by market trends. Ultimately, Mivar demonstrates that a television brand is far more than a trademark stamped onto a plastic bezel. It is an intricate web of local assembly lines, trusted neighborhood shopkeepers, and accessible repair benches that once anchored an appliance within the life of a nation. When global logistics compressed the value of hardware, that human ecosystem dissolved. In a quiet room in suburban Italy, a collector reaches out and presses the heavy power button of a surviving 14-inch Mivar set. The familiar static crackles across the curved glass, and a brilliant image snaps into focus, illuminating the room with the warm glow of a vanished industrial empire. See you in the next video.